If you've ever sat in a hospital waiting room, you know the exact smell I'm talking about. It's that sharp, sterile mix of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee. That's exactly what I was breathing in on a Wednesday afternoon at St. Jude Medical Center in Chicago. I was sitting on a faux leather chair that had a long, jagged tear right down the left seam. My left wrist was wrapped in a thick white bandage, still throbbing from the carpal tunnel release surgery I'd had just 2 hours prior. I am 66 years old. I spent my entire career as a high school history teacher, trying to impart lessons to teenagers about the rise and fall of great empires. But on that particular afternoon, the only thing collapsing was my own reality. I reached into my coat pocket with my good hand. Inside, I had exactly $47 in cash, two crumpled 20s, a 5, and two ones. Beside the cash was my phone, an outdated model I'd been meaning to replace, with the battery icon blinking ominously at 4%. I had no charging cable, and my house keys. That was it. That was my entire inventory of survival. I wasn't supposed to be stranded. Just that morning, my only son, Brad, had 39, a senior software engineer making the kind of money that makes people nod with respect when you mention his job title. The hospital had a strict policy. If you go under any kind of anesthesia, even a local block with mild sedation, you cannot take a cab or a rideshare home alone. You need a designated family member or friend to sign you out. I hadn't wanted to bother him. I know he's busy. But he called me earlier that week and offered. He made it sound so simple, so responsible. When I woke up in the recovery bay, my fingers were numb, and my mouth tasted like dry gauze. I waited for the curtain to pull back, expecting to see my son looking at his watch, ready to take me home. Instead, a young nurse walked in. I'll never forget her face. It was that specific, tight-lipped expression medical professionals get when they have to deliver bad news that has absolutely nothing to do with your health. She stood at the foot of my bed holding my discharge clipboard, and she told me the truth. She said Brad had sat in the waiting area for exactly 15 minutes after they rolled me back into the operating room. He spent the entire time aggressively scrolling on his phone. Then he walked up to the front desk, interrupted the receptionist, and claimed he had an emergency company meeting. He didn't ask if I was out of surgery yet. He didn't ask how the procedure went. He just looked at the receptionist and delivered the lie. My mother has made other arrangements for her ride home. And then he walked out the back exit. He took the employee back door just so he wouldn't have to walk past the recovery wing. He slipped away to avoid the inconvenience of his own mother. The nurse looked at me with a mixture of deep pity and barely concealed anger. She was waiting for me to break down. She was waiting for the tears, the panic, the outrage. But I didn't cry. You see, when you've been a single mother for 41 years, pride becomes your spine. You learn very early on that falling apart doesn't get the bills paid, and it certainly doesn't get you a ride home. So I just gave her a polite, quiet smile. I thanked her for her care, signed my paperwork with a trembling right hand, and took the elevator down to the main lobby alone. Which brings me back to that torn leather chair. I sat there, doing the brutal math in my head. I lived out in the suburbs, a solid 28 miles from downtown Chicago. $47 wasn't going to cover a taxi, not even halfway. As I pulled my phone to check a bus schedule, the screen went black, dead. I sat there watching people come and go, families holding on to each other, husbands helping wives into cars, daughters bringing their fathers coffee. I felt an overwhelming, crushing weight settling on my chest. The realization that I had spent my entire life pouring everything I had into a son who viewed me as a minor burden he could simply abandon at a receptionist's desk. I was just about to stand up and ask the security guard where the nearest bus stop was, regardless of how far I'd have to walk, when something caught my eye outside the heavy glass doors. A massive, pristine black Mercedes Maybach glided up to the main entrance, bypassing the taxi lane completely. It stopped right at the curb. The rear door opened, and a woman stepped out. She looked to be in her late 40s, dressed in an impeccably tailored slate gray suit, the kind of presence that commands a room the second she walks into it. She was giving instructions to her driver when she casually glanced through the glass doors. I watched her freeze. Her posture went completely rigid. She stared straight through the glass, her eyes locking directly at me. Without hesitating, she pushed past the automatic doors and walked into the lobby. She didn't just walk toward me, she marched, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the linoleum. She stopped right in front of my torn chair, and then this elegant, clearly powerful woman did something that the security guard and two passing nurses stop in their tracks. She dropped down onto one knee right there on the dirty hospital floor, so she was perfectly eye level with me. Her eyes were wide, shining with something I couldn't quite place. "Miss Margaret," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "My God, I've been looking for you for 22 years." The man in the tailored gray suit gently closed the heavy door of the Mercedes Maybach behind us, sealing out the hum of traffic and the sterile panic of the hospital entrance. The interior smelled faintly of sandalwood and aged leather, an absolute vacuum of peace compared to the fluorescent-lit waiting room I have just escaped. The woman sitting beside me was Victoria Vance. At 48, she was the chief executive and board chair of Vance Tech Global, a regional tech giant valued at $420 million. Her face was calm, her posture precise, but her hands were trembling ever so slightly as she adjusted her cuffs. She didn't take me back to my empty house in the suburbs. Instead, 20 minutes later, our car slid into a quiet, secluded parking space behind a dimly lit, upscale bakery on the edge of the city. We sat across from each other in a private corner booth. A young server quietly placed a pot of hot chamomile tea and two plates of toasted sourdough with fresh avocado on the dark wood table, then vanished without a word. Victoria didn't touch her tea. She reached into her structured leather briefcase and pulled out a single dog-eared photograph, sliding it across the polished surface toward me. The edges were yellowed and frayed. It captured a moment frozen in time from the autumn of 1994 at Lincoln High. In the frame, a 15-year-old girl with matted hair and a tattered denim jacket was slumped over a library table, her face buried in her arms, crying so hard her shoulders shook. Resting firmly, protectively on her right shoulder was a hand with a silver wedding band. My hand. Victoria looked down at the photograph, her voice dropping to a low, steady murmur that carried the weight of decades. $1,250, Victoria said softly, her eyes locked onto mine. That's the exact amount you paid out of your own pocket for my school fees and cafeteria vouchers that entire semester. You logged it into the administration system under a fake donor title, the Anonymous Student Relief Fund, so I wouldn't have to look you in the eye and feel the humiliation of being charity. I stared at her, the fog of the past rushing forward, the memory of a rebellious, fiercely angry teenager who had been abandoned by her own family slammed into my chest. I remembered the long, punishing afternoons in that dusty library, the smell of old paper, and the tears that wouldn't stop. Victoria reached across the table, her manicured fingers pressing firmly over my trembling, bandaged hand. She repeated the exact words I had spoken to her in the quiet library 32 years ago, her voice cracking just a fraction. You have more value than a failing grade on a progress report, Victoria. Do not you ever dare give up before you've even had a chance to start. I sat in silence, the steam from my chamomile tea curling upward between us. I had spent my entire life believing that the kindness you throw out into the world simply evaporates into the void, absorbed by the air, leaving nothing behind. I had never imagined that someone could hold on to a lifeline for over 30 years, carrying it like a compass through corporate boardrooms and multi-million-dollar acquisitions, until it brought her straight to a torn leather chair in a hospital lobby. Victoria pulled her hand back, picked up her porcelain cup, and finally stated the real reason she was sitting across from me today. I just closed the acquisition of the historic Meridian Commercial Tower downtown, Victoria said, her business tone returning, sharp and precise. And I am establishing a public education foundation funded at $15 million to support retired public school educators and at-risk students. I don't want a board of disconnected investors running it, Margaret. I want you. I want you as our honorary chairperson and core consultant, starting at a baseline retainer of $180,000 a year. I looked from the photograph on the table to the powerful, fiercely loyal woman sitting in front of me. $47 and a dead phone battery were still sitting in my coat pocket back in the car. But as the afternoon light caught the edge of the teacup, I realized the math of my life had just completely changed. The heavy iron gates of Oak Ridge swung open smoothly, revealing a winding lane canopied by centuries-old oak trees, whose thick branches had weathered generations of storms. The air here carried the crisp, earthy scent of damp grass, wet pine needles, and polished stone. When the black Maybach finally glided to a halt in front of the grand Georgian-style manor, the heavy mahogany front door opened before the driver could even cut the engine. A woman in her 60s, with silver hair neatly pinned back, stepped out to greet us. Her name was Eleanor, the household manager. Her welcome wasn't the practiced, superficial smile of paid hospitality that you see in upscale hotels. It carried a quiet, genuine reverence that made me feel instantly seen and respected. She escorted me up the wide, carpeted staircase to the East Guest Suite, a room expansive enough to swallow my entire apartment back in the city, featuring tall French doors that opened up to a view of a marble courtyard fountain where water trickled in a steady, calming rhythm. Alone in that magnificent room, my old habits took over like second nature. I slipped off my coat, folded it with meticulous precision, and placed it neatly over the back of an armchair. Then, moving by pure instinct, I unzipped my worn leather purse, pulled out the exact $47 in cash I had carried out of the hospital lobby, and laid the bills flat on the bedside table, beside my dead phone. It wasn't a gesture of bitterness or anger. It was a physical anchor, a quiet line drawn between the harsh reality I had lived just hours ago and the surreal dreamscape I had somehow stumbled into. I needed to look at those crumpled bills to remind myself who I was and where I had come from, so I wouldn't lose my footing in this sea of sudden luxury. An hour later, a soft knock on the door signaled dinner. We gathered in the formal dining room. The table was vast, polished to a mirror finish, illuminated by the warm amber glow of a crystal chandelier hanging from the high ceiling. The meal was simple yet extraordinary. Pan-seared wild salmon with fresh herbs, roasted baby potatoes, and a glass of crisp white wine that sat beside my plate, untouched, catching the light. Throughout the meal, Victoria didn't push me for an answer regarding the foundation offer. She understood the weight of silence. Instead, she spoke about the decades that had slipped past since 1994, filling the quiet space with memories of a life built from the ground up. She talked about the bitter winters living in a converted garage with 3 second-hand desktop computers, surviving on instant noodles, and working 20-hour days while her startup bled money and everyone around her told her to quit. She spoke of the moments she wanted to give up, when the weight of failure felt unbearable, and how she would close her eyes in the dark and remember a dusty high school library and a teacher who refused to let her vanish into the background. There were no grand speeches, just raw, unvarnished history delivered in a steady, calm voice across the candlelight. I listened in absolute silence, cutting small pieces of salmon without actually eating them. The weight of her gratitude wasn't heavy or suffocatory. Rather, it was clarifying, like looking through a window after the fog had finally burned away. Finally, I set my silver knife and fork against the rim of the porcelain plate. The metallic clink echoed softly against the high walls of the dining hall. I looked straight across the table, into Victoria's eyes, holding her gaze without flinching. "I need 72 hours to think about this, Victoria. Not because of the salary, and not because I doubt your sincerity, but after 66 years of living a life where I only knew how to give, how to pour everything I had into others without expecting a return, I am entirely unaccustomed to receiving anything of this magnitude. I need time to figure out if I still know how to accept grace." Victoria didn't argue. She didn't try to persuade me or sweet-talk me. She simply nodded once, a gesture of absolute respect, and raised her wine glass in a silent, understanding toast. Later that night, long after the household had quieted down and the staff had retired, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass window in my suite. Outside, the entire estate was bathed in the soft amber glow of landscape lights, casting gentle ripples across the surface of the artificial lake below, where the wind brushed the surface. I pressed my palm against the cool glass. For the first time in as long as I can remember, the crushing, claustrophobic darkness of my cramped apartment, the constant underlying panic of rent, grocery bills, and growing old alone, was entirely absent from my chest. The air in the room felt light, wide open, and strangely full of a future I never dared to write for myself. A future I never thought I deserved. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge of the estate when the silence of my second day at Oak Ridge was shattered by a sharp, aggressive vibration on the bedside table. I picked up the landline phone in the guest suite. The caller ID wasn't necessary. It was Brad. His voice didn't carry an ounce of relief or concern. It was coated in a thin layer of manufactured panic and wounded pride. He demanded to know where I was, citing a call from the hospital security office about my unassisted departure, and accused me of orchestrating some kind of bizarre public stunt. I gave him a single, quiet sentence in response, keeping my voice completely level. "I am somewhere I won't be a disruption to your career, Brad." I hung up before he could answer. But a man like my son doesn't let go of what he perceives as a threat to his comfort or his potential inheritance. Through a nosy former neighbor back in our old neighborhood who traded neighborhood gossip for a living,
Brad managed to trace the registration plates of the Maybach all the way to the gates of Oak Ridge. 24 hours after that phone call, the estate's private security alert chimed. On the high-definition monitor in the security annex, I watched two figures standing outside the towering wrought iron front gates. One was Brad, pacing restlessly in a designer windbreaker, running a hand through his hair. The other was my former brother-in-law, Robert, a 52-year-old commercial real estate speculator whose life had been a decades-long train wreck of failed ventures and mounting debts. He was sweating through his cheap suit, shifting his weight from foot to foot. They were loudly demanding that the gate security guards let them in to rescue an elderly, manipulated woman from a predatory billionaire. The guards looked toward the house for instructions. I could have stayed upstairs, safely cocooned behind double-paned glass and stone walls. Instead, I straightened my cardigan, walked down the grand staircase, and chose to meet them face to face in the mansion's secondary reception parlor, where tall windows looked out over the front drive. When the heavy oak doors of the parlor swung open and the estate manager escorted them, neither Brad nor Robert looked at my bandaged wrist or asked how my surgery had gone the week before. They didn't care about my health. Brad immediately crossed the room, his eyes wild with suspicion, and hurled his accusation straight into my face without even a greeting. "Have you lost your mind, Mother? What kind of legal documents have you signed with this billionaire scam artist? Do you have any idea who she is? She's using you. She's setting up a scam to cover her corporate tracks." Before I could even blink, Robert stepped forward, elbowing past his nephew. His face wore that familiar greasy smile of a man who spent his life looking for shortcuts. He reached out and gave my uninjured shoulder a heavy, far too familiar pat, dragging the conversation straight down to the gutter where he lived. "Let's cut the drama, Margaret," his tone dripping with false familiarity, after 7 solid years of complete silence between us since the bitter family estate battle over my parents' old house. We're family after all. Look, Brad is trying to close on a $450,000 downtown condo, and I'm in a tight corner needing $50,000 in cash by Friday to stop the bank from foreclosing on my commercial lot. You're living in a palace now. Why don't you just ask your rich new friend to write us a check? It's pocket change to her." The room went entirely dead quiet. I looked back and forth between the two men standing in front of me. One was a son I had spent 31 years pouring my youth, my savings, and my heart into, shielding him from every hard edge of the world. The other was a parasite who hadn't spoken to me since he tried to cheat me out of my inheritance a decade ago. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tremble. I let my gaze settle on them with a cold, absolute clarity that made both of them shift uncomfortably. When I was sitting alone in that hospital waiting room with $44 in my pocket and a fresh surgical cut on my wrist, neither of you came. And standing here right now, inside these walls, absolutely nothing in this place belongs to you. Before Robert could open his mouth to sputter another excuse, the two private security guards stepped smoothly into the parlor, their presence commanding and unyielding. Within 3 minutes, Brad's furious shouting and Robert's desperate, angry threats were echoing down the gravel driveway as the heavy iron gates closed behind them, locking their greed firmly on the outside where it belonged.
3 weeks had melted away into the crisp autumn wind since those two unwelcome figures were escorted off the grounds of Oak Ridge by the estate's security team. I thought perhaps they had finally accepted the boundary I had drawn, realizing that manipulation, guilt tripping, and bullying no longer held any power over my life. But greed doesn't surrender quietly when it smells potential money or feels its control slipping away. Instead, it retreats into the shadows, only to sharpen its teeth for a heavier, more vindictive strike. It arrived on a bright Tuesday morning in the form of a heavily bound, 34-page legal complaint delivered directly to Victoria Vance's corporate headquarters by a private courier service. The legal documents bore the expensive, intimidating letterhead of a high-priced downtown law firm, retained specifically by Brad and Robert, designed to make anyone shudder at first glance and question their own footing. I sat across from Victoria in her private study as she slowly flipped through the dense pages, her expression chillingly calm, completely devoid of any surprise or hesitation. The contents of the lawsuit were as absurd as they were deeply malicious. The formal complaint accused Victoria of severe elder exploitation and undue influence, alleging with twisted fabrication that she was systematically manipulating a vulnerable, mentally declining senior citizen to usurp a non-existent family inheritance. Furthermore, they petitioned the civil court for an emergency guardianship order, demanding that complete, unmonitored control over my personal, legal, and medical decisions be legally handed over to my son, Brad. They were launching a $5 million civil suit, neatly wrapped in a hypocritical shroud of fake, theatrical concern for my well-being and mental safety. Victoria didn't flinch, and she certainly didn't panic or lose her composure. She closed the heavy binder with a soft, decisive click, picked up her desk phone, and placed a single call. Within 2 hours, she had mobilized the elite litigation team of the state, a powerhouse firm, whose senior partners billed their expert time at $1,200 an hour, representing the absolute pinnacle of legal defense available in the entire region. The first countermove wasn't a loud, theatrical courtroom speech. It was clinical, undeniable medical proof that could not be argued against. 2 days later, I was driven to a neutral medical facility downtown to undergo a formal Montreal cognitive assessment, overseen directly by two independent forensic psychiatrists appointed by the court. I sat in a quiet, sterile room answering your complex questions, identifying intricate shapes, recalling long word sequences, and drawing clock faces under strict, unyielding supervision. When the evaluation concluded, the lead doctor signed off on the official assessment report. I had scored a perfect 30 out of 30, a level of cognitive sharpness and mental clarity that surpassed even individuals decades younger than my 66 years. My mind was entirely my own, sharp and unshakable. Armed with a pristine bill of mental health, Victoria's legal team launched the second phase of their defense, a comprehensive digital trap that Brad and Robert never saw coming. Instead of merely filing a routine motion to dismiss the case, the defense team submitted an encrypted digital package containing comprehensive evidence pulled straight from the high-definition security archives of both St. Jude Medical Center and the Oak Ridge estate. First, the court was given the hospital lobby security footage from the exact day of my wrist surgery, accompanied by the attending nurse's sworn digital affidavit. It captured the exact timestamp when Brad sat scrolling on his phone, walked up to the reception desk, and lied about an emergency corporate meeting, and abandoned me to walk out the back exit. Second, the package included the crystal-clear audio recording and multi-angle video footage from the Oak Ridge front gates.
capturing Robert stepping up to pat my shoulder and aggressively demanding $50,000 in cash to bail out his failing real estate lot, and Brad's desperate push for a $450,000 downtown condo. Finally, the forensic audit of my personal finances, pulled quietly by Victoria's investigators with my full written consent, was attached to the file. It laid out a clean, undeniable paper trail, a bank statement from the previous year proving that Brad had siphoned $12,000 in unauthorized withdrawals directly from my retirement savings account while I was away visiting a sick cousin, leaving my emergency buffer nearly dry. The trap was fully set. Every single lie they had built their $5 million lawsuit upon was systematically dismantled by cold, unyielding digital proof, leaving their malicious intentions completely exposed to the harsh light of the law.
The chaotic storm in the hospital hallway finally broke, leaving behind a heavy, breathless quiet. Clara and Richard were gone, their carefully constructed empire of lies reduced to ash on the linoleum floor. But the harsh reality of the pediatric oncology ward didn't care about our family drama. The truth had set us free, but the truth couldn't cure acute leukemia. Lucas was still dying, and the clock was still ticking, louder and more unforgiving than ever. I spent the next 48 hours pacing the length of the waiting room, waiting for the results of the HLA tissue typing. I had already signed every piece of paperwork, offered up every drop of blood, every bone in my body, absolutely ready to be carved open if it meant giving my boy a tomorrow. But the universe has a strange, brutal way of teaching us what family actually means. When Dr. Eris Thorne finally walked through the double doors, his face was unreadable. He asked me to sit down. I refused, and then he delivered a blow that knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. My marrow wasn't a match. Despite my absolute willingness to give my life for his, biology slammed the door in my face. For 3 agonizing seconds, the hospital walls felt like they were collapsing inward. I thought we had fought through 3 years of manufactured hell just to reach a tragic dead-end finale. But Dr. Thorne held up his hand, stopping my spiral before it could hit the ground. He turned his tablet around, pointing to a glowing green sequence on the screen. Through the National Marrow Donor Program, a hit had surfaced just hours before, a perfect 10 out of 10 match. It wasn't me, it wasn't a distant relative, it was an anonymous stranger sitting halfway across the American continent, someone who had simply swabbed their cheek years ago and decided to say yes when the phone rang. The profound weight of that realization hit me like a physical force. The miracle we desperately needed didn't come from a shared bloodline. It came from the deliberate, selfless choice of a total stranger. The next 2 weeks were a grueling, terrifying medical protocols. To prepare his body to accept the donor cells, Lucas had to endure conditioning chemotherapy, a brutal regimen designed to completely wipe out his existing, failing immune system. I watched through the heavy glass of the isolation room as the harsh chemicals stripped away his strength, leaving him painfully thin and entirely bald. He was taken right to the very edge of the abyss, his body a blank canvas, waiting for a second chance at life. Then came day 0. It wasn't a dramatic surgery with scalpels and bright surgical lights. It was agonizingly quiet. I stood trembling outside the sterile glass wall, watching a nurse hang a small plastic bag filled with a reddish fluid onto the IV pole. Those were the stem cells, flown in overnight on a commercial red-eye. I watched, barely breathing, as the life-saving cells traveled down the plastic tube, slipping into the port in Lucas's chest. It took less than an hour to rewrite the entire ending of his story. The wait that followed was the hardest part of the entire 16 years I had been a mother. Days melted into nights, marked only by the monotonous beep of the heart monitor and the frantic checking of his white blood cell counts. We were waiting for engraftment, waiting to see if the stranger's cells would find a home in his hollow bones. On the 14th day, the numbers finally ticked upward. The fever broke. I was washing my hands with harsh antiseptic soap before putting on my yellow isolation gown and blue gloves when the nurse tapped frantically on the glass. I rushed into the room. Lucas's eyes were fluttering open. The heavy, morphine-laced fog that had clouded his vision for weeks was finally lifting. He looked terribly fragile, his bare head resting on stark white sheets, but his eyes tracked across the room, past the humming machines, until they locked onto me. He didn't look away. "Mom." It was a barely audible rasp, a single cracked syllable pushing past a dry throat, but it echoed in my chest louder than a thunderclap. It was the exact word they had tried to steal from me. I fell to my knees beside his bed, ignoring the stiff plastic of my isolation gown, and wrapped my gloved hands around his terrifyingly thin fingers. I pressed my covered forehead against his knuckles, and the dam broke. I sobbed, a deep weeping that carried 3 years of stolen time, silent exile, and the overwhelming relief of a mother who had just pulled her child back from the grave. I felt his weak fingers squeeze my hand in return. The gap of the missing years evaporated right there in the sterile air. A moment later, the heavy door clicked open. Liam stepped into the room, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. He walked over, placing his hand gently on Lucas's shoulder. Lucas looked up at his younger brother, his voice shaking with the exhaustion of a survivor waking from a nightmare. "The texts? The things she said you wrote?" Liam's jaw tightened, tears immediately spilling over his lower lashes. He leaned down, his voice dropping into a fierce, unbreakable vow that instantly severed the very last string of Clara's manipulation. "We never sent them. We never stopped waiting for you to come back." That was the final nail in the coffin of their lies. The monstrous narrative that they were ashamed of their poor mother. It was completely vaporized. We were battered, bruised, and wearing sterile hospital plastics, but as I looked at my two boys holding on to each other, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The blood in Lucas's veins now belonged to a stranger, but his life and our family belonged exactly where we chose to be.
6 months had drifted away like autumn leaves since the gavel came down in that downtown courtroom, sweeping away the final remnants of noise, lawsuits, and manufactured threats. The dust had settled into a quiet, enduring peace across the manicured lawns and stone courtyards of Oak Ridge. By October, the Community Education Fund, officially incorporated as the Margaret Vance Foundation, was fully operational, launching its first major initiative with a $3 million disbursement that directly funded scholarships, mentorships, and educational support programs for 450 underprivileged students who desperately needed a foothold in the world. I no longer lived in the suffocating shadow of self-doubt or the quiet, gnawing panic of counting pennies just to survive from week to week. My daily life had found a rhythm as steady and comforting as the grandfather clock ticking softly in the estate's main hall. I had my own second-floor office, bathed in the soft, warm light of autumn afternoons, overlooking the sprawling gardens where the trees were slowly turning amber and gold. I spent my mornings reviewing grant applications and my afternoons walking the stone pathways with Eleanor, sharing quiet conversations that felt like a life I was finally learning how to inhabit with grace. Yet, true emotional healing isn't just about stepping into a better, safer room. It's about walking back into the exact place where you broke, just to prove to yourself that the shadow can no longer hold you captive. It was a crisp Thursday afternoon in late October when I asked the driver to take me back into the city. I didn't stop at corporate offices or downtown cafes. I had him drop me off at the main entrance of St. Jude Medical Center, the exact building where this entire fractured journey had begun, almost to the day. I walked through automatic sliding glass doors into the main orthopedic waiting room. The antiseptic smell of bleach and old carpet hit my senses instantly, bringing back the sharp sting of that rainy morning when I sat alone with $47 and a fractured wrist. I didn't look for Brad. I didn't ask the reception desk for news of my family. I simply walked over to a quiet corner of the room and sat down on one of the worn, blue vinyl chairs. A few feet away from me, sitting hunched over with his head resting heavily in his hands, was a man in his 60s. His right arm was wrapped in thick, bulky medical gauze, and his posture radiated a profound, isolating despair. He was staring down the scuffed linoleum floor, staring into a vacuum of total helplessness, his shoulders trembling slightly under the weight of an unannounced crisis. I didn't rush. I didn't offer grand wisdom or forced, empty cheer. I slowly slid my chair across the floor, closed the distance between us, and gently rested my hand on his uninjured shoulder. The day feels awfully long when you're carrying it all by yourself, doesn't it? I said, my voice soft, steady, and entirely free of pity. Take a breath. You don't have to figure it all out right this second. The man lifted his head, blinking through sudden tears, and for a fleeting second, the terrifying tightness in his chest seemed to loosen its grip. 10 minutes later, I walked back out through the hospital's sliding glass doors into the cool autumn air. Standing by the curb beside the familiar black Maybach was Victoria. She wasn't holding legal briefs or corporate documents. She was holding 2 paper cups of hot tea, steam rising into the chilly afternoon breeze. She handed one to me without a word, a quiet gesture of partnership that spoke louder than any contract ever could. As we stood there together by the curb, a single golden maple leaf broke free from a branch above and landed softly against the wool of my coat. I brushed it away with a quiet smile, finally understanding the profound truth of the road behind me. The deepest wounds in our lives aren't meant to destroy us. They're often the narrow doorways that lead us home. We spend decades measuring family by blood and shared lineage, only to discover that true belonging isn't written in DNA. It is measured simply by who stays, who listens, and who stands beside you when the rest of the world turns its back and walks away into the dark.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.